The wedding hall was a glittering cage of crystal chandeliers, golden drapes, and meticulously arranged orchids that perfumed the air with a sweetness so thick it almost made Alexander Grant choke. It should have been a moment of triumph, a grand celebration of wealth and alliance, the union of two powerful families sealing their names together in history. For the hundreds of guests dressed in gowns and tailored suits, it was the event of the year, an evening to gossip about, to brag about attending. But for Alexander, the most talked-about CEO in the city, it felt like a trap. He stood at the altar like a soldier forced into surrender, his jaw locked, his eyes dark as steel. His mind repeating the same bitter thought over and over again. He had been tricked. Marriage had never been in his plans. Not like this. He had built his empire with relentless discipline, a company that had transformed from a small startup to a global force in less than a decade, earning him the reputation of a ruthless genius. Everything in his life was controlled, calculated, and precise. He chose his clothes with care, his meals with attention, his investments with flawless strategy. But tonight he had no control. Tonight he was about to marry a woman he barely knew. A woman whom whispers claimed was plain, unattractive, and hardly worthy of a man like him. It was supposed to be a strategic alliance, a family demand he couldn't escape. But in his heart he felt like a fool standing before the world, ready to bind himself to someone who would tarnish his image. The priest's voice droned in the background as guests shifted in their seats, their jeweled fingers clutching champagne glasses, their curious eyes fixed on the aisle. Alexander's lips pressed into a thin line. He could hear them already, the laughter, the murmurs, the snide remarks about the mighty Alexander Grant reduced to this. Some said the bride's family had exaggerated their daughter's qualities to force his agreement. Others whispered that she had begged for this marriage, desperate to tie herself to power and money, a CEO known for perfection, marrying a woman known only for her obscurity. The thought of it boiled his blood. Then the music swelled. The doors opened. The bride entered. The hall collectively inhaled, but Alexander's eyes hardened. She moved with grace, her steps measured, her back straight, but her face was hidden beneath a thick lace veil. The fabric fell heavy, concealing every feature, revealing only the faint outline of her lips and chin. He felt a sharp twist in his gut. Was she hiding what others already knew? Was the veil protecting him from the shame of facing the truth too soon? Every eye followed her as she walked closer. Her gown shimmered in the light, delicate embroidery catching the glow like liquid silver. Guests leaned in, some whispering, some smirking, waiting for the reveal. Alexander stood unmoving, his fists clenched at his sides, his pulse thundering. He had built his empire on logic, on facts, on figures. But tonight he was surrounded by uncertainty, trapped in a story that felt written by someone else. When she reached him, her hand extended, he hesitated. Her fingers were slim, soft, and warm against his, but he barely acknowledged the touch. His voice, when he repeated the vows, was clipped and cold, every word sounding like a contract clause rather than a promise. In contrast, her voice was calm, steady, and smooth, carrying an unexpected strength that unsettled him. There was no tremor, no nervousness, no desperation. She spoke as though she were not marrying a man who despised the very thought of her, but rather choosing her own fate with quiet confidence. The vows passed in a haze, his mind clouded with resentment. Every time he looked at the veil, anger coiled tighter in his chest. He imagined the newspapers printing photos of them tomorrow, his handsome face beside her shadowy one, headlines mocking his downfall. Alexander Grant settles for less. His pride howled at the thought. He was a man who had always been on top, the untouchable, the man no one dared to laugh at. But tonight, he feared becoming a joke. The priest's voice rose to its conclusion. "You may now kiss the bride." The air in the room shifted, growing heavy with expectation. Alexander's hand twitched. He knew what came next. He would lift the veil. He would see the truth, and everyone in the room would see his reaction. His chest burned with rage and humiliation as he reached forward. He didn't want this moment. He wanted to escape, to walk away, to tear the whole charade down. But duty and pride bound him to the stage. His fingers brushed the lace, hesitated, then lifted. For the briefest second, time froze. He had braced himself for disappointment, for the confirmation of every ugly rumor, for the final twist of the knife that would remind him how thoroughly he had been deceived. But when the veil rose, the sight that met his eyes shattered every assumption he had carried into this day. His bride was not plain. She was not desperate. She was not the woman the whispers had painted. Her face was radiant under the golden light of the chandeliers. Her eyes, a luminous shade of amber, glistened with a quiet fire that struck him silent. Her lips, soft and curved, held the faintest trace of a knowing smile, one that carried both gentleness and a hint of challenge. Her skin glowed with a warmth that the veil had hidden, and her features, delicate, balanced, and breathtaking, were a vision he could not have imagined in his most honest dreams. Gasps rippled through the hall. Guests who had come ready to mock now stared with wide eyes, their whispers turning into stunned silence. "She's beautiful," someone muttered under their breath, unable to hold it back. Another voice, incredulous, added, "They said she was ordinary, look at her!" The tide of gossip shifted in a single heartbeat. Alexander's chest tightened painfully. His carefully constructed anger cracked, leaving him hollow and unprepared. For the first time in years, he was at a loss. His pride, his arrogance, his certainty that he had been tricked, it all felt like sand slipping through his fingers. He had been wrong. Completely, utterly wrong. His bride met his stunned stare with calm composure, as though she had expected this moment, as though she had been waiting for him to see what others could not. The faint smile on her lips seemed to say, "Now you know." Alexander's heart hammered in his chest. For a man who had spent his life commanding boardrooms, silencing rivals, and dictating the future of industries, he suddenly felt powerless. His entire body was tense, caught between the urge to retreat into the shell of arrogance he had always worn and the undeniable pull of the truth in front of him. The priest cleared his throat, breaking the spell. The room leaned in, waiting for the kiss. Alexander hesitated, then leaned down, his lips brushing hers with the briefest of touches. It was supposed to be an obligation, a tradition, but the moment burned through him like fire. Her lips were soft, her presence overwhelming, and the touch, short as it was, shook him to his core. When he pulled back, he realized the hall had erupted into applause. The guests no longer whispered about humiliation, but about beauty, power, and the unexpected twist of fate. Alexander, however, heard none of it. His mind was consumed by the image of her eyes, the quiet strength in her smile, the way she had stood so calmly while he drowned in doubt. The ceremony ended, and as they walked down the aisle together, her hand resting lightly on his arm, Alexander felt a conflict he could not resolve. He had come into this night believing he was the victim of a cruel trick. But now, with every step, he wondered if he was the one who had been blind. And as the doors closed behind them, sealing away the roar of the crowd, he realized with startling clarity that nothing in his life would ever be the same again. The ballroom was quieter now, the echo of the ceremony fading into the murmurs of guests enjoying the endless buffet and sparkling wine. Yet in the corner of the grand hall, where golden curtains framed tall glass windows, Alexander stood stiff, his hands clenched inside his pockets. His wife, his bride, stood beside him, her posture straight, her gaze composed, her veil now gone. He could still hear the gasps of the audience from earlier, still feel the burn of shock when her face had been revealed. Every time he glanced at her, he was unsettled by the same truth. She was far from the woman he had believed her to be. Beautiful was too small a word. She carried herself with a quiet radiance, a presence that drew the eye and silenced doubts. Yet she looked at him not with affection, but with something sharper, something that made him feel like she was the one in control. Alexander was used to power. He had spent years building his reputation as a man no one could outsmart. But standing beside her, he felt as though the ground had shifted, as if she had rewritten the rules of a game he had mastered. He sipped his champagne, trying to disguise his unease, but when he turned his eyes to her, she was watching him. Not shyly, not nervously, but with a calm directness that made his throat dry. "You look troubled, Alexander," she said softly, her voice barely carrying over the music. He swallowed. "I wasn't expecting this." "Expecting what?" she asked, tilting her head slightly, her amber eyes reflecting the chandeliers. "You," he admitted, the word slipping out before he could stop it. "Not like this, not—" He hesitated, unwilling to say beautiful, unwilling to show vulnerability, but she seemed to read it in his silence anyway. Her lips curved into the faintest smile, one that stung more than it soothed. "You believed the rumors," she said. It wasn't a question. It was an observation, a truth laid bare without accusation, but it hit him like a blade. He stiffened, his pride sparking in defense. "I heard things." "And you trusted them," she finished for him, her tone steady, not cruel, not mocking, but with the weight of quiet disappointment. "You built an empire, Alexander Grant. You learned to see through lies, to uncover truths hidden in numbers and contracts. But when it came to me, you trusted whispers more than your own judgment." Her words cut deeper than he wanted to admit. He turned his gaze away, staring at the guests, twirling across the polished floor, laughing in their expensive suits and gowns. "This marriage wasn't my choice," he muttered. "No," she agreed softly. "It wasn't mine either. But that doesn't mean we should step into it blind." Her composure unsettled him more than anger would have. He had expected her to cling to him, to beg for approval, to act grateful for the chance to marry a man like him. Instead, she stood unshaken, her voice calm, her eyes sharp enough to pierce through his walls. It was he, not she, who looked cornered. As the night wore on, they moved together through the crowd, smiling for the cameras, greeting politicians, investors, and family friends. To the world, they were the perfect couple. The powerful CEO and his luminous bride, bound together in a union of wealth and influence. Yet beneath the surface, Alexander wrestled with questions he couldn't shake. Who was she, really? The whispers had been wrong. So catastrophically wrong. But if she wasn't the desperate plain girl people had described, why had she allowed the rumors to live? Why had she hidden her face until the last moment? It wasn't until the celebrations ended, the guests departed, and the grand house grew quiet that Alexander finally confronted her. Their new home was vast, filled with marble floors and tall ceilings, but the silence was thick, pressing between them like a third presence. She removed her earrings slowly, placing them on the dresser, while he stood behind her, watching the reflection in the mirror. "Why didn't you correct them?" he demanded at last, his voice low but firm. She met his eyes in the glass, unflinching. "Because I wanted you to see me for yourself, not through anyone else's words, not through your pride, just me." His jaw tightened. "You let me believe." "I let you choose what to believe," she interrupted gently, turning to face him. "If you were the man the rumors described you to be, you would have dismissed me no matter what I looked like. If you were the man your pride said you were, you would have walked away even if the truth was in front of you. I needed to know which one you were." Her honesty stripped him bare. For a moment he couldn't speak. He, Alexander Grant, master of negotiations, feared being outmaneuvered by the very woman he had underestimated. He took a step closer, lowering his voice. "And what did you find out?" She held his gaze, her expression unreadable. "I found a man who doubts before he trusts. A man who listens to the world before listening to his own heart. But also a man who, despite his arrogance, still looked at me tonight as though he had been struck by lightning. That gives me hope." Her words disarmed him. For years, Alexander had been praised, feared, admired, envied. But hope? No one had ever looked at him and spoken of hope. The word unsettled him in a way he couldn't define. He looked at her again, really looked, and realized the truth he hadn't wanted to face. She was not only beautiful, but strong, unshakable, unwilling to bend to gossip or to him. She was not a woman who had tricked him. She was a woman who demanded to be seen, not just looked at. The days that followed were filled with silence and tension, but also with an unspoken pull between them. At formal dinners, she sat poised beside him, speaking with elegance and intelligence that left even seasoned politicians intrigued. In private, she carried herself with quiet independence, never seeking his attention, never begging for his affection. And the more she withheld, the more Alexander found himself drawn to her. He had thought her beauty was what shocked him, but it was her strength, her refusal to bend, that left him restless at night, unable to shake her from his thoughts. One evening, as rain streaked across the tall windows of their home, he found her reading by the fireplace, her amber eyes catching the glow of the flames. He sat across from her, watching her lips move slightly as she followed the words, and without meaning to, he said, "I was wrong about you." She looked up, surprise flickering in her eyes before she smiled faintly. "Yes, you were." The admission felt like a release. For the first time, he let the pride fall away. He told her of his fears, his anger, the humiliation he had dreaded, the empire he had felt slipping through his fingers. And she listened, not judging, not mocking, but simply hearing him. When he finished, she placed the book aside and said quietly, "Then maybe now you can start seeing me for who I am, not for who others told you I was." In that moment, Alexander realized how blind he had been. He had mistaken whispers for truth, arrogance for strength, pride for vision. But the woman before him, his wife, was the first person who had ever made him question himself, the first person who refused to be overshadowed by his name. And for the first time in his life, Alexander Grant felt something he had never allowed himself to feel. He wanted to earn her respect, her trust, maybe even her love. The world outside continued to see them as a power couple, a perfect image of beauty and wealth, but within the walls of their home, something more profound began to grow. Their conversations deepened, their silences grew less heavy, and Alexander found himself looking forward to the moments they shared. What had begun as a union of obligation was becoming something unexpected, something neither of them had planned. And late one night, as he watched her sleeping beside him, her hair spilling across the pillow, her hand resting lightly against his chest, Alexander understood the truth he had resisted since the veil was lifted. He had not been tricked at all. He had been given a chance, a gift he had almost thrown away because of his pride. He had married not just a beautiful woman, but a woman who would challenge him, ground him, and perhaps, if he was worthy, love him. For Alexander Grant, who had once believed he was a victim of deception, the revelation was clear. Everything had changed the moment he lifted that veil, and nothing, neither his empire, his pride, nor his carefully controlled life, would ever be the same again.